Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. And if this is the first time you're seeing my channel, welcome to my channel. This is Scott's Comics Retro Review. You can shorten it, because I realize it's a mouthful, you can shorten it to SCRR, SCRR, however you want. But this channel is dedicated to people who want to get into comics, but they're not sure where to begin, or they're already are into comics and they just haven't read the books that I'm currently reviewing. So if you know anyone that's in either one of those situations, go ahead and pass the video along, or any of the videos along. Thank you very much. Let them know about my channel. Anyway, I'm going to do John Byrne's Superman. Superman happens to be my fourth favorite superhero. And if you've been watching the videos, like in order, because I have them numbered, there is a bit of a method to my madness, even though they kind of jump all over the place. And Superman, the main reason why he's number 4 is because it's mostly out of deference and respect to the character. I mean, not only is he a good character, but also the history of comics is kind of tied into the history of Superman. And I wanted to go on and go through that with you. There are different people talking about different things when it comes to comic books, and about when the first comic book was and all that good stuff. And I'm going to start with what's known as the first, I guess, modern comic, which happened decades ago. That was in 1934. It was a comic book called Famous Funnies. Now, understand that back then there was really not a whole lot of entertainment like you see today. There was no video games, there weren't TVs in everybody's homes with 500 channels on it. You didn't have all these streaming services. You had basically the movies, which you kind of went to once a week on the weekends. You paid either a dime or 5 cents depending on what you were doing, and you would go there and you would get cartoons, you would get news, you would get some comedy shows. You would get what they call a serial, which would be a modern equivalent of, say, CSI today, except that it continued into one long story. Or you ended up with, and then you had a major feature, one of the big features of the movie, feature movie. And you'd spend all day at the movie theaters. And then at home, you kind of had the radio, which everyone kind of gathered around, and you had books, and you had magazines, and you had newspapers, and that was kind of it. And with the newspapers, they had comic strips in the newspapers. I haven't bought a newspaper in a long time, so I don't know if they still have it. I know the digital newspapers I looked at, there's no comics in there. But back then, comics were a very popular feature in the newspapers. And what they did was you had comic strips and you had comic books. And like the earliest comic books before Famous Funnies would be something like, if you walked into the store and you bought a pair of Buster Brown shoes, for example, you would get a free giveaway comic of Buster Brown. And that's kind of what it was. It was mostly just advertising for, you know, their brand of shoes, or whatever it is they were selling. You had Raggedy Ann dolls, and you would get a Raggedy Ann comic, things like that. And then you had the comic strips in the newspapers, which they would go and have adventures, you know. On a daily basis, you would read the adventures. And what they did was they decided to take the comic strips and put it in a comic book. They collect it all together and put it in a comic book. And if you went to the movies, it would be a free giveaway. Well, there was a guy by the name of Maxwell Gaines. And I'm going to do another video on Maxwell Gaines later on. He's what I consider one of the founding fathers of comic books. But what he did was he took that Famous Funnies, which was given away at movie theaters and had no price tag on it, and he put a 10-cent label on it and brought it to newsstands. And he gave it to these newsstands. I don't know if they have those in New York anymore, but you used to have newsstands on all the corners in the cities, and they would sell newspapers and magazines and stuff like that. So he gave them the comic books, and he said, go ahead and sell what you can, and I'll come back and take what you don't. Well, it sold. It sold very well, and I believe it sold out, although accounts are sketchy of what actually happened. And that's when a new business was born. And that famous funnies with the 10-cent price on it is what I consider the first modern comic. And what happened was is you would have these magazines, like, today would be Sports Illustrated or, say, Time. And the magazine would be in a building in Manhattan, and it would be like 3 or 4 of these large, spacious floors with spacious offices and a lot of hustle and bustle going on. And then in the like little corner, these rinky-dink little offices, you would have the comic book division of these magazines, and they kind of usually went under a separate name. I believe, not all of them, but I believe most of them did that. And what happened was they would gather all these these reprints of the newspapers, and they'd stick them in a magazine and they'd sell them. And that went on for about a year, when the company that would eventually be known as DC went ahead and did what's known as New Fun Comics. And with New Fun Comics, they did all new material because it was cheaper to hire and pay these guys to do to create news stories than it was to pay these syndicates. So from there, the industry started growing. And what happened was they needed to fill up a comic book magazine called Action Comics. Don't worry, this isn't the first Action Comics. It wouldn't look this nice. And they had a whole bunch of features in there, right, which had Zatra the Magician and all different kinds of features. And they were trying to fill it out. And they took these 2 guys called Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who was already working for the comic book companies, and they bought what they had was a character called Superman. Now understand that back then, when you worked for the newspaper strips, you made a lot of money. The more newspapers it was in, the more money you made. So if the syndicate bought your strip, they would go out and put it in as many different newspapers as they can. And the more newspapers it went in, the more money you made. So everyone that was in comic books were trying to get into the newspaper strips. And Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster was no different. They took the Superman strip and they brought it around to all these different companies, the syndicates, which kept rejecting it. Well, since Action Comics needed to fill out that, the issue, Max Gaines again told the guys who were at DC to take a look at this Superman thing. So they went ahead and did it. Action Comics #1 came out in 1938, and Superman got on the cover, and that's what's considered the beginning of the Golden Age. And Superman was the first superhero, and he started the whole thing that you know of today. Now let me fast forward a little bit and get into John Byrne's Superman. I'm going to get back to more of the history and all that good stuff, but I kind of wanted to get into John Byrne's Superman. And he came in 1986. DC had done a series called Crisis on Infinite Earths, which kind of reset everything. I'm going to do a video on Crisis down the road. But John Byrne created what I considered my favorite version of Superman in the comic book form. And he came over from Marvel Comics, and it was a big deal that he came over. And he started with this mini-series called Man of Steel. And it was each issue focused on something different. Like you had this cover, and then you had this cover, both for #1, which was showing the beginning of Superman. Then they focused on Lois Lane, who was very important in Superman's life. Batman, who at the time was considered his best friend. Lex Luthor, his worst enemy. Talked about Bizarro. And then it talked about where he came from. And when John Byrne came over and he did this, Superman, this is Krypton. And before this, Krypton kind of looked like Earth. It's just that the buildings were a little weird and the people dressed a little funny. But this is the first time it looked like an alien planet, to my knowledge. I don't recall anyone else making it look like an alien planet. And this is Jor-El, Superman's father, and this is Lara, Superman's mother. And the planet's about to be destroyed. I think we all know the story. And Jor-El's talking about shipping his son off to another planet. And he shows his wife what they're going to look like, what the planet looks like. And she's freaking out. She's like, oh my goodness, look at how they're dressed. They have their bare skin exposed to the air, things like that, which showed how alien this culture was. And it's the first time something like that happened. Anyway, he gets shipped off. The planet the planet explodes, and then it comes to Earth. Well, he fast forwards to when Superman's a teenager, and he's found by Jonathan and Martha Kent, and they're telling a story about that. And I'm skipping pages because I don't want to get a copyright strike, and I don't want to mess up your enjoyment of reading the story. But he tells the story about how they found him when he came down in a rocket ship. And they don't think he's an alien, they just can't figure out what's happening. And through the years, as he was getting older, he would gain different powers. His first power was when he got trampled by a bull, and he wasn't hurt. And they were surprised at that. And it was through the years that this happened, as he was getting older. So it's not like he got his powers all at once when he was a baby. Then he's like lifting up a truck to get his ball. His dog pushes him off, and he starts flying, things like that. So he got his powers one at a time, which is very interesting. Then they show, I don't want to give anything away again, and I don't want to get a copyright strike or anything like that, but at the end, he shows up in his costume for the first time in Man of Steel. That was the end of issue 1. The end of issue 2 talks about Lois Lane, and what happens is she's chasing Superman down to get the story, which is very interesting. He is the story, and she's trying to get it. And John Byrne did some very interesting things like this, where the guy's, he snatches the purse and he starts running, and all of a sudden there's a guy standing in front of him, and then he turns around and he runs away, and the guy's in front of him again. And John Byrne was paying homage to the Christopher Reeve Superman movie at the time, because he did similar things to that. He didn't steal anything from it, but he did similar things to that, which was very interesting. And I don't want to go through what happens from there, but Lois keeps showing up too late to get the story, and that's what she's doing. She's chasing the whole story down. And the next one talks about Batman, and I remember John Byrne giving interviews when he still worked at Marvel Comics, and he was talking about if Superman and Batman met, that they would try to kill each other when they first met. And I didn't understand why, because I always thought of them as best friends. Up until this point, they were always best friends. I also did a review on Frank Miller's Dark Knight, which was actually the first all-out fight between Superman and Batman. And I'm the kind of person that believes that, if Batman's not using magic, or if he doesn't have kryptonite, he's not going to beat Superman. And that means it's not him that's beating Superman, it's the kryptonite that's beating Superman, in my eyes. People have different views on it. And by the way, Batman, I prefer him as a hero over Superman, but I still don't think he can beat Superman. Anyway, it shows how they first met and how Superman's going to take him off to jail because he's a vigilante, and I don't want to give anything away there, but it's a lot of fun because he's trying to get Batman in jail. Then the next one is talking about how Lex Luthor became his enemy. By the way, look at this gorgeous artwork by John Byrne. Dick Giordano is the inker, and I mentioned Dick Giordano before, and I'm definitely going to mention him again, but he's a phenomenal inker. He's inked some of my favorite stories. But what's interesting is Lex Luthor has hair here, and by the way, the Man of Steel series, it started after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Crisis on Infinite Earths kind of hit the reset button for DC Universe. I'm going to do a review on that. But when the last issue of Crisis on Infinite Earth hits, it's like the heroes have already been out for a few years, and John Byrne's picking up from there. So this Man of Steel series is mostly in flashback, so it's telling kind of what happened to Superman before that point in time where we begin. And Superman's already been Superman for a couple of years. So this is when he becomes a bad guy of Lex Luthor. Now, Lex Luthor, originally, back in the Golden Age, when he first showed up, he had a full head of red hair. And as time went on, they made him bald. In this, what's known as the Silver Age, which I will get into, he was bald since he was a kid. And he blamed Superboy for it, which is an interesting story. But here it starts out where he's a rich business tycoon, and he's got hair, and he's a brilliant inventor. What I always thought was funny is if he was such a brilliant inventor, why didn't he create a hair loss serum to regrow hair? Anyway, this is gorgeous art. It's a great story. I'm going to go ahead and end this here on this first book. If you're interested, go ahead and check the links down below. I have it set up. This is Scott's Comics Retro Review. Have a great day.